Welcome everybody to our inclusion focus webinar tonight. When we started thinking about inclusion, we were thinking very much about the current trends of discussions about inclusion and what it really means to many of us. And we suddenly realized that there are so many facets to it that we don't often consider every element of inclusion. And so we thought we would explore it together. I will give my perspective and Gwendolyn will reflect on her experiences as a Senko in a nursery and her work with children and what it really meant. We also chose inclusion because there is this myth that Montessori has got some magic that will enable us to teach all children with special educational needs. I think it goes historically back to the time when she worked in the clinic, and it goes back to the beginnings of the Montessori approach. But actually, she has got some very, very important tools that we all use every day, but there is no special magic. And I personally don't really believe that Montessori is panacea for all special educational needs, particularly as we know so much more about different conditions that children experience today. And as we realize that working with specialists is a very, very important aspect of really helping the children. So as the introduction goes, there are really three parts to our talk today. We would like to have a look at the inclusion policy and what our governments and our governing bodies requires us to do. In England, we all have to have an inclusion policy. It is often done as means of necessity. And once it's done, it's kind of put in a folder and it's often forgotten. It is, so it becomes quite tokenistic. And we forget that inclusion in terms of policy doesn't just mean inclusion of children with special educational needs. It means also diversity. It means also that we need to consider every individual child in our setting. And of course, the child is coming to us in the context of his or her experience or culture. And that therefore implies that we need to work with the families and we need to engage with the culture from which the child comes. So we immediately are looking at the Bronfenbrenner model of child development or social development of children. The impact of the immediate family, but also the impact, particularly today, of COVID and this whole bigger picture that has impinged the life of every single child that we have today. Then we have, of course, the element of working with the children who need our help in the nursery, and that requires working with families, and it requires every bit of diplomacy and careful consideration and often huge amount of patience and deep level of commitment to the child and to the family. And then it comes to the children and what it really means to the children to be truly included in everyday life of the nursery. And for me, I think that each one of us has got some element of special needs, not only as children, but also as adults. We all carry some baggage with us. And that, of course, impinges on how we perceive the world and how we deal with situations. So perhaps some of what we will be discussing tonight can be transferred to some of the work that you do with parents. Thank you again for joining us. It's wonderful to see the screen so full of all of our friends wanting to engage with Montessori musings. And I am very glad that Gwendolyn will share the conversation with us today. And should we remind people about ground rules, or are we
Yes.
all?
Well, you're all so good at this now. You know what the ground rules are. Just if you'd like to share something, then pop it in the chat or raise your electronic hand. You can do that by clicking on participants and then raising your hand there. If you could keep your microphone on mute, otherwise that just means that your background noise doesn't interfere with ours. I just want to echo what Barbara said. We've talked so much about this session tonight, haven't we? We keep, having a meeting about something else, and then we drift into this conversation again about inclusion and about children in your setting who might have additional needs of any sort. We just can't stay away from it. And I think what's really important to say is that we are under no illusion that we are, we don't want to, I guess what I want to say is we're not here to teach our grannies to suck eggs. You are all extremely experienced, practiced practitioners, but we do, in our conversations, we've stretched our view on this topic together, and we would like to share that with you tonight about how we might support the children in our setting. So that's just my.
I think what was so fascinating as we were preparing for tonight's session, then Gwendolyn found a piece of writing about inclusion by Cassie Nutt-Brown, who certainly of all the earliest practitioners in the UK has the strongest voice, the fairest voice of the child in mind, and also writes beautifully. So it is very lovely to hear her writing. But we were shocked by the fact that the article was written in 2006. And effectively, nothing has happened in those 14 years. We are still struggling with the same issues. And we are, in a way, we have more children who need our help, more families who need our help, but we are not really seeing them as one whole. We often want to fix a specific little piece of the puzzle without actually seeing the whole puzzle completed. In the article, Cassie Nutt-Brown recommends the Index for Inclusion. And if you wanted to check your policies, or if you wanted to reflect on your setting's approach to inclusion, we would very much recommend that you use the index as your guide, because it is very comprehensive, it's very accessible, and takes the three elements of the sort of policy and procedure, the family and the community and the child into consideration. In the article, Cassie Nutt-Brown gives a most wonderful little vignette or case study of a childminder taking a child to see the trains. And she's very sensitive, and she guides the child up the stairs, and they oversee the train track. But the child gets interested in the passers-by. And she then very gently turns the child's head and wants the child to watch the trains. And I thought how interesting it is that we so often put our agenda of wanting to help the child in front of what the child might really need for him or herself. Because for that child, the learning wasn't about the trains, even though he enjoyed watching them. He was curious about the people. The child opened the opportunity for us to teach the child, or shared the moment of the strangers passing by with the child, and she has totally missed it. And what I loved about the way how Cassie Nutt-Brown has written it, she has just very gently pointed us towards the voice of the child without having real judgment on the practice of the practitioner. And I think that is the real skill, because we often judge the families of the children with whom we work based on our own experience of children, based on our own values and our own framework of understanding children. And that often means that we miss an opportunity to help the parent and then help the child. Did you find that a little vignette interesting?
Yes, I love that. And what you're saying, and this is something that we discussed a lot over the last few weeks, isn't it? keeps coming up in all our webinars and in all our, you know, in the play working group and in our webinars, what it keeps coming back to is communication, right? So it's what you're saying about this lack of judgment, or, you know, the judgment that we must try and park somehow in order to communicate with the parents. Communication, every time it comes back to communication. And this partnership that we build with the parents to support ultimately the child. You know, that ultimately is always our goal, isn't it? Is to support the child. And if we don't have a good relationship with the parents, if we don't communicate with the parents, then how can we help the child? But it's
and of course every family responds to our initial approach in a different way.
Yes, and you had a very, very a good anecdote about that, Barbara, about a child in your setting who came to you.
So we, the one child that I thought I had nothing to offer to, I was on the verge of engaging with the parents to say, you know, I don't somehow think that we are right for him. He doesn't seem to enjoy being in the nursery. And then on the day when I was going to approach the parents, the child came in the nursery and she said, have you seen the volcano? Mount St. Helens erupted. And he obviously seen it on television. And I said to him, yes, I have seen it. And, you know, let's come with me. Let's go in the cupboard. We will find, I've got some books about volcanoes. And that sharing of the information has totally turned his attitude or his being accepted in the nursery, or suddenly he was a different child. And it was only when we really engaged with him that the parents were willing to share that, first of all, it was the second nursery he has come to. There was a new baby in the family. So he came with so much baggage, which the parents were not really willing to share. So we couldn't really, but because he offered something and we responded to it, we were able to turn things around, and he had very happy 3 years with us subsequently. So again, but not every parent will respond in that way. And I think that in the book that we published about parenting at MCI, we had an introduction by a mother whose child was born with Down syndrome. And I absolutely loved what she said. She said she kind of went over the impressions of or emotions she had after the child was born. And she said, first she was disappointed because the girl wasn't perfect. Then she was disappointed because the aspirations she had for her were not going to happen. They would have to be different. It was only when she saw her as being beautiful for what she was, when she saw her as the child that she was really able to develop a relationship with her. And I suppose that's what really inclusion means in the wider context. We need to be able to accept each child for the beauty they offer us, not for what the parents expect or what we expect of them. So leaving the baggage behind the door and just hearing the child and what they need. And for that, the biggest tool that Montessori gives us is an observation. There is no special magic, but there is just observation and getting to know the child really, really well. I wondered if you wanted to add some of your ideas from your practice.
Yes, I did. And I think, you know, I see all these very experienced practitioners in front of me on the screen here. So I think we all have these stories to share. But from my personal experience, what happens sometimes is that I certainly would get stuck. So I would think, why is this child, you know, I have these beautiful materials. I have pouring. I know pouring, you know, the practical life activities, they're going to encourage concentration. So here you go, do some pouring, and then thinking, why is this child not concentrating? What's going on? You know, okay, well, I'll try something. I'll get another activity from the shelf. Well, why is this child messing up this activity? Why is he mixing all the beans that are in all the different pots? Why is he not engaging with it properly? And I think, so, you know, how about lining up the knob cylinders? You know, all of them. Let's get them all out and put them back in. Well, why is he walked away? Why is he not completing this activity? And getting more and more frustrated because the child in question isn't engaging with the materials that I thought would offer this concentration or you know, the sort of the normalization that we're after. And it's exactly what you say. You know, there are children for whom this may not be the right activity. And that doesn't mean that Montessori isn't for them. It just means that these activities aren't for them. And it's up to me as a practitioner to find the right activities to engage these children. So just like you with your little boy found something that sparked an interest and could feed on that, this is the role. And sometimes it might be outside. You know, sometimes the activities might be taking place outside. Sometimes they might have to be much, much larger than a small tray on the shelf. You might need to get out the tough tray and they might need to mix it all up. But if that is what helps the child, then that is what we need to do.
And Montessori guides us in that so very wisely. She says, believe in the child who is not yet there,
Yeah.
whatever the there means.
Yeah.
But that real believe in the trust in the child's capacity to find what they need, and really looking at our environment and what it may need, what we need to add to this beautiful classroom.
Yeah.
And sometimes we are challenged. We have to add things which we don't perceive to really belong.
Well, and then we get back into that debate of, oh, it's not a Montessori activity.
Absolutely.
What does that mean? You know, if it works for the child, then, you know, if it suits the child, then surely it's a Montessori activity. I see so many interesting comments in the chat box, and
yes,
about, you know, the agenda of the adult and the agenda of the child. And this goes back to this communication that we keep talking about. You know, when you first show a prospective parent around your setting, what are you promising them?
Yeah.
What are they hearing? Because, you know, as we've talked about this idea that, oh, well, you know, so we've got the numeracy shelf and we've got the literacy shelf, and when the child is ready, they might start working with the sandpaper letters. And what the parent may well be seeing and hearing is, when your child leaves the nursery or the earlier setting, they will have worked with these materials. Well, they may very well not have, because they may very well not have been ready. So it's these expectations that you're setting, and making sure that the parents are on board with what you're offering.
But also recognizing that even when your environment is rich, children in their own personality and characteristics will choose typically activities. So I had a child who was a master builder, but I also had a child who was a real mummy. She loved caring for the other children, and she created play scenarios which drew the other children to her. So during the time when she was with us, there was actually lots of mummies and daddies and lots of domestic play. And then when we had the master builder, there was lots of building. So sometimes the really competent children in the environment will introduce their agenda to the other children, and they get inspired by them. And that's the value of the vertical grouping. Then they bring their skills to the group and the children absorb it. And I think we often forget about that. We think, oh, we are not using the whole range of the materials, so there must be something wrong with the children, instead of thinking, so what else can I add to the environment to make it interesting for the children?
Well, absolutely. And I think, the children will vote with their feet and their hands, right? You will immediately see what is attractive to them and what isn't. And, I remember I would spend hours, creating the most wonderful tuft trays, and really rich, thinking, well, this is obviously going to appeal. And the children be like, yeah, no. And do something completely different. Sometimes you share wonderful stories about your granddaughter and you will have a lovely activity for her and she'll sort of look and go, no thanks. That sort of, and don't take it personally. What can you do with it? So you're observing the child, they're not engaging with it. So then what? So then what can you do? How can you make it work for the child?
Yes, and I'm on the Montessori teachers Facebook page this morning, somebody said, well, we need to give them meaningful activity. Well, meaningful to whom? To us or to the children?
Yeah.
Because as you have mentioned, Fionn, I told you this morning that she took out all the cupcake cases, the silicon cupcake cases, which are in the cupboards in the kitchen. There were many different shapes and sizes and colors. And I immediately said, oh, shall we sort these by color? And I started to organize them. And she added very nicely to it, not organizing in any specific way. And when she finished, she said, this is my flower bed. And she put the stuffed cow that is that animal that she enjoys at the moment, she put it next to her and she said she can have a feast. Now, that to me was so interesting because the flower beds that they have got in their garden have been recently planted and they are great possession of their parents. So nobody can go on the flower beds. So she sort of lets the cow to go there. After all, nobody can do anything about a cow eating the flowers. That's how it is. So there was even a bit of mischief in an activity which I started by saying, let's start sorting by color and shape. And it was totally different. It wasn't color and shape. So again, then Wendelin said, well, why don't we let the children just initiate the activity and then just do tiny little changes or tiny little suggestion, in order to see if they will engage with our idea, because there is value in the adult adding ideas, but they need to be added with such sensitivity and care so that the child absorbs them quite naturally and is able to do them very, if it appeals to them. And again, Montessori tells us that we will not always get it right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we mustn't blame it on the children, because then we often say there's something wrong with the child. Yes. And our son, who has done quite a lot of work with young children, always says that we need to see the children for who they are and how they, rather than for the condition that they may have, because that may be the way of representing themselves. And that was the perfect example from the Ken Robinson talk when we were discussing him about the child who would never sit still and always wanted to dance. And the mother takes her to a specialist and he says, go outside. He puts on a piece of music and the child starts dancing. And he goes to her and says, there's nothing wrong, just get her dancing lessons. And she became one of the leading choreographers. But had they tried to stop her from moving and from her natural means of expression, she could have been easily diagnosed with ADHD and all sorts of other conditions for which she would have been medicated.
Yeah,
when in fact she was showing her natural gift, her natural aptitude towards the kind of unique trait that she held in her hands. So, yeah.
It's interesting. Charlotte has mentioned, and I've certainly experienced this in setting, that there are children, because of perhaps some additional needs that they have, struggle to return things to the shelf. And in the sort of rigid Montessori classroom, this of course gets the practitioners quite nervous. You know, we've got a child here who's not returning their work to the shelf. I mean, how is this possibly going to work? I love, Charlotte, that you've said that with reassurance from us and the child being allowed to be free, they've really settled and they're learning in their own way. You know, I've had battles with a child who wouldn't return their work to the shelf. And for why? Why did I engage in that? You know, it was doing nothing for the child. None of the others were bothered about this child not returning the work to the shelf. They continued to return their work to the shelf. It had no impact on because I think that's a fear sometimes practitioners have. It's like, well, if one kid does it, I mean, I saw a quote on a Facebook group, which was monkey see, monkey do. You know, if I let one child do it, all of them will do it. And apart from that, the phrase really upset me
horrible.
quite a lot. Actually, kids aren't like that, or they might copy it for a day and then get bored of it and return to, you know, what they feel is right. So I think we just must keep coming back to this fact that we must follow each individual child and support them to help them.
I see a couple of interesting comments in the chat box. Marianne's recommendation of the 7 C's of model of resilience. Maybe we should pursue it in one of our talks. It's Mikey Kobia idea about resilience and what it really means. And I think it's a very, very interesting model that looks at the whole child and how the whole child manages resilience. And of course, then Joanna reminded us about the social model of special
Medical
needs,
model,
and our social model of pedagogy. And it is our preferred way of looking at children with special needs rather than looking at the medical model. But even that is not perfect because, like all theories, it doesn't fit all the children. And that effectively brings us to this idea that people think that Montessori will be the ideal way for their child with special educational needs, or they often turn to Montessori because they expect we have got some magic wand that will fix their child. I'm particularly aware that there often there are links between autism and Montessori provision, and there's quite a lot of evidence that, in fact, Montessori and children who are on the autistic spectrum, particularly who are quite difficult or have got quite well developed condition, will not necessarily settle into the Montessori environment and will find it quite difficult. And equally, the Montessori practitioners find it difficult because they cannot manage the tantrums and the anger that is within that child for not managing their environment. And so then that becomes tension, and often the children get expelled. And yet there are Montessori practitioners who advocate that there is some kind of panacea Montessori for more autism, when in fact it just so depends on the child, it depends on the family, it depends on the skills of the practitioner. You know, how well you can work with others in order to provide something better for the child, how well we can work with the family.
And I think so. One of the things we wanted to mention is, you know, the policies that a setting has addressing inclusion, and one thing that I want to add to that is also the hiring of your staff. And actually, what sort of questions are you asking people who might potentially join your team? You know, how are you challenging them before you even employ them? And it'd be interesting. I can see practitioners on the screen, so it'd be interesting to hear what you all, you know, pop in the chat. Do you talk to them about inclusion, what their thoughts are, and how they might deal with a situation that might challenge their thoughts on inclusion, and how do we engage with diverse? How do we include a diverse range of parents. You know, and this might be parents who don't have English as a first language. This might be parents who might have a learning challenge of their own. You know, how do we engage with these parents, and how inclusive are we of them? And again, like you said initially, Barbara, you know, how much judgment is there in there, particularly when we look at the child. So I think we need to really look, you know, at this Bronfenbrenner model that you were mentioning, at all the layers that are around the child, and observe the child.
Yes, and I think that is, you know, we are now getting very complex family relationships. How are we accepting of that? I have got a friend who fosters, and one of the children that she fostered has been adopted by two dads. And I couldn't have wished for a better home for this child. And yet, they always have to be one step ahead of him, preparing the school, ensuring that the school will not single him out because of his unusual family situation.
Yeah.
Well, why? It's just the child that comes to our setting, isn't it? And that child needs some help. So we really need to be able to leave many of these prejudices or preconceptions or expectations or aspirations behind, if we want to really get to know the child and be able to help them and guide them in the way they need to be guided.
And it's interesting what Suzanne says here, that many people find it difficult to ask necessary questions. And Suzanne, I presume that you're talking about, you know, if in your sort of interview with staff, just nod if yeah. They are uncomfortable conversations, absolutely. But as you say, if you don't have that conversation when you're hiring people to join you in your team, then it's going to get very uncomfortable. It could get very uncomfortable later if, as you say, Barbara, you're faced with, you know, a modern family, as I would say, a modern family situation, which may challenge a person in your team.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that Wendy has shared that every child with additional needs has something special. It's finding the special thing which will enable us to create that unique relationship with the child, because once you have found it, you will love the child for the gifts. And I know from Wendy, when she talks of Archie and his love of nature and his knowledge of nature and what they can share together, no other of her grandchildren would give her the same kind of pleasure to celebrate the child, nature and the experiences they have together. So really, it still goes back to the Montessori quote: believe in the child who is not yet there. Because if you are searching, when you find the very special thing that will make the connection between you and the child, then you have created an emotional bond, and you will go beyond, because you already have that connection and you really understand that child a little bit more than you have done until you have made that connection. I think that is so very important. And I have seen that some settings are really exceptionally good in making these connections and then being able to provide beautifully for those children because they have made the connections. And what happens then, that they come to be known for their capacity to support these children. And then suddenly they find themselves overwhelmed, and the balance within the setting shifts because so many parents need help and support. So how we manage to satisfy the needs of all the children in the setting and all the families by seeing each child as an individual, I think is the real challenge for us as we go forward. Yeah,
absolutely. I think what does need to be said is it's particularly for those of us working in early years, it can be extremely tricky also, I mean, it's wonderful if you're a setting known for your support of children with who might need additional support, because and if parents are coming to you because they've already identified that their child needs additional support. But very often when you're working in an early years environment, you might be the first to raise the alarm bell.
Yeah.
And that's hard. And I'm not even going to start pretending that I ever got it right. It's an incredibly challenging conversation to have. And I was really struck by something you said when we, in one of our many conversations, Barbara, is that it's good to start planting those seeds so that the parents are prepared as the child progresses on their educational journey. But it goes back to that communication. It goes back to that partnership that you have with the parents and the trust that you have to build with the parents. Because when you are the one who starts suggesting that, as you mentioned in the book, the MCI book about parenting, that your child, that your amazing child is not perfect, and I'm putting little quote tags as I say this, because I obviously, that's your first confrontation with it, that's hard. Very, very hard.
And it takes time, doesn't it? Chipping away very slowly, and listening to what the parent says in order to help the child. It's really, really difficult, because I think fundamentally at the bottom of their heart, the parents know there is something wrong, but actually voicing it, it's part of that difficult conversation.
Absolutely. And I've two things. So one thing that I said, and then you said something in response. So I mentioned that our sort of local authority head of special educational needs always talked about, when you're talking to parents, or when he was talking to parents, he would always say that every child has a little backpack, and in that backpack are a bunch of tools, and no child has the same tools. No person has a backpack with the same tools, and it's up to us as practitioners and as the adults around the child to find what tools need to be added to this backpack. And you added to this that your son Danny, who works with children as a psychotherapist, yes, am I right?
Yeah.
That he said that it is not helpful with children at this very young age to attach labels. And that's why I love that backpack analogy, where we're not saying your child has ADHD, because we can't even say that at children of that young, but your child has social communication issues. We think they might be on the spectrum, so therefore we need to do this. That backpack with tools, and we need to just figure out what tools the child needs to help them on their way. I thought that was a really sympathetic way of having a conversation with parents.
It's a little bit like the Reggio analogy of giving the child an extra pocket.
Yeah.
What will be in that pocket will depend on the language of the child. And it is our role as a practitioner not to diagnose, not to group, but to put something in that pocket or in that backpack, which would allow the child to be more whole. And that is only possible if we observe and if we listen and if we share our observations with our colleagues, because each one of us will interpret the behavior in a slightly different way. This is not a task that you can do on your own. You may begin the journey as your key person by noticing something, but you need to share, and also you need to ask colleagues outside the Montessori community, because there is specialist knowledge. There are people who will be able to guide us. So yes, somebody just put that in the box, who said we need to acknowledge the help of the specialist. Yes, we can't do it. And I would not want anybody to think that when the child normalizes, the child is cured. If only that was possible, we would have a hunky-dory world. Even even the child who may have the most extreme condition will find moments of concentration and engagement if we have found the right tool to put in the toolbox. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about as we go forward, that we have got the capacity to put something in the backpack. We have got the capacity to put something in the pocket, which will make the child stronger, more resilient, more able to cope with their conditions as they continue on the journey. And we work with the parents in trying to find a way how best to serve that child. And that applies to all children in the setting, not just the children who display some peculiar behaviors we don't understand.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that is what Montessori really gives us, and that's the gift that we have for the future from everybody.
Absolutely. Joanna shared a beautiful quote here: for a pedagogical approach to be truly inclusive, it needs to ditch the notion of there being a most and a few, i.e. the idea of including a few with additional needs into the fold of the most or the normal majority in favor of an approach towards the inclusion of everybody. I really like that, Joanna. Thank you.
And I think that would be a good quote to finish on for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for your additions, for your comments. Hopefully, we have allowed you to think a little bit beyond what you do every day, and we have encouraged you to listen and have uncomfortable conversations so that we can serve the child on their future journey. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next week for the book club.